call this meeting of the City Finance Committee to order. And do we need to do a roll call?
I don't believe.
Okay,
so.
we're here, so,
Do we?
okay.
I think we have.
All right, so I'll turn it over to Ms. Tomaszewski and for the mid-year finance report.
Good afternoon, Chair Friedman, committee members. I am Jennifer Tomaszewski. I am the Finance and Treasury Manager for this for the Finance Department. And with me here today is Mark Sewell, and he's the Accounting Manager. And we will be presenting the mid-year financial review for fiscal year 2020. Normally, I would just jump right into the revenues, and because I have not presented to all of you before, I wanted to give you a kind of a background about why we do this and what the purpose of this presentation is. So by city charter, we are required to present monthly status reports of our financial operations. So we do that. You'll see interim reports on the agendas every month for interim and then also for our monthly investment report. But we do a check-in with the Finance Committee every quarter, and it's really kind of a snapshot in time to say, how are we doing compared to our budget at mid-year? So 6 months in, how are we doing compared to our budget? We aren't necessarily forecasting out how we're going to be doing by year end. As you're aware, we're coming into budget season, and you will be getting a lot more in depth with the departments, how they're forecasting, where they'll be as they're putting together their budgets for next year. So this is really just kind of a check-in and to go through a little bit more detail to give you information about how we're operating in fiscal year 2020 so far. So with that, I will be going through the general fund revenues, and then Mr. Sewell will take over and go through the expenditures. He'll go through some of the highlights for the enterprise funds. And then also we take a quarterly proposed budget adjustment schedule. And what that is an opportunity to do, some of the more routine budget adjustments, cleanup items, sometimes adjustments to projects, more complex budget adjustment requests would come in separate items. So this is really more kind of the routine, more routine things that you'd be seeing. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start with the general fund revenues. And I have 4 slides for you today, and each of the slides are going to be presented in this format. So we look at our general fund revenues in 3 categories. We have taxes, other revenues, and then fees and charges. Those are departmental revenues. And in this table, we show the annual budget of about $162 million. And then we have a year-to-date budget, and that's seasonally adjusted. We look back, at the last 3 years and take an average because some taxes or some revenues don't come in, every month the same amount. So it adjusts for that seasonality. So, for example, property taxes. At mid-year, we've only received 34% of our property taxes. We get the majority of those in the second half of the year. So we adjust for that in our year-to-date budget. And then we have our actual to date through December 31st. And then where we really have our conversation is in this variance column. We also have prior year revenue, just to put some context to that. And then we do have what we call our anticipated year-end variance. And what that is, it's really a budgeting tool that we use. We know when we forecast our salaries that we're going to have some savings through attrition or vacancies. And this is a balancing tool that we use. So we budget for this revenue, but you'll never see the actual revenue in there. So when we have our discussion, we're talking about before that anticipated year-end variance. So just to help explain what that is. So what we see is at 6 months in, our revenues are coming in about $5.9 million higher than our year-to-date budget. Now that's a little misleading because we have a couple one-time revenues that I'll talk about on the next slides. And if we adjust for those 2 one-time revenues, we're really looking at a deficit of about $1.1 million at mid-year. And that isn't forecasting out where we're going to end the year. It's just at this point in time at December 31st. So now where you see the tax variance is about $2.8 million. That's Now, on the next slide, we have more details. So we have our sales tax and our Measure C, and we talk about those together, but there are a couple nuances that are a little bit different. We have property tax, utility users tax, and so on. And I'm just going to hit some of the highlights. So with our sales tax and Measure C, if you notice our annual budget for those, the sales tax was budgeted about $1 million higher. And that's because Measure C is still fairly new. Last year was the first full year of receiving Measure C, and there are some nuances between a district tax and our regular city tax. For example, how that goes through the state and the county pool, and how online sales function, and then how they pay us. So sales tax is wired directly to the city into our bank account. For some reason, they send us a check for Measure C. And so that check comes later, and $2 million of that is what you're seeing is we received a check at the beginning of this year for fiscal year 19 money. So if you back out that $2 million and adjust for the budget differences, if you look at their actual year to date, they're tracking pretty close. We have seen sales tax and Measure C coming in higher than we budgeted. We've been, we're always cautious, but what we are seeing is two impacts to changes that the state made, and that there is now taxation on online sales, and then also the Amazon effect, the Amazon and eBay effect. So we are seeing those coming in higher, and we do anticipate those will be above budget at year end. We will, on a cash basis, you're seeing that $2.9 million right now. That'll be adjusted when we do our accruals at year end, but we are expecting that will come in higher. Property tax is slightly down. When we put our budgets together, we look at the trend in property tax, and we did forecast when we set the 2020 budget of about a 5.5% growth, and it's coming in fairly close to that. The one exception is our supplemental property taxes. Those are based on the timing of sales, and they fluctuate significantly from year to year. So it's a little low, but tracking fairly closely to budget. UUT, this is a combination of several utilities rolled up into this one. So we've got electricity, phone, cable, water, refuse, natural gas, and they all trend very differently. So where cable, for example, we know that that's been tracking low, from year to year as more people switch over to, the streaming services such as Netflix and Hulu, and away from traditional cable service. And the same thing with telephone services. More people are switching from landlines to the cell phones, and then there's competition with providers forcing those rates down. And then that's offset by increases in water and refuse as those rates go up. So we're tracking UUT closely. It's fairly close to budget, but it is, we do account for all those, but it is coming in lower for those reasons. I wasn't going to talk much about TOT other than to say it's very close to budget at this point. We have, we do talk regularly with Visit Santa Barbara, and they have communicated that pre-bookings for groups are up, and so that's, a positive sign for how we'll do going into the spring and summer months. But right now, the budget is set with a 3% growth from last year, and it's coming in pretty close to that. Business licenses is also up a little bit, and that's a pretty stagnant number. That doesn't change a whole lot from year to year. But what we are seeing is that business license staff has been fully staffed, and we're able to collect those delinquent revenues more quickly. So the big unknown has been cannabis excise tax. So we've added this new this year. As you see, last year we only had about $27,000 in cannabis revenue last year. And then in the second half of the year, 2 of the medical dispensaries opened up, But we still hadn't had any of the recreational facilities open. Now, 2 of those recreational facilities have opened, and we are seeing that those revenues are coming in strong. We do know that in the next few weeks, one of the manufacturing and distribution businesses will also be opening. What we don't know is when we hit that saturation point. So again, cautiously optimistic. We had originally thought we would hit about $1 million, and then the state came in and said, well, the black market for cannabis is still really high and it's not coming in at the state. So we cut that in half this year for about $500,000, but we anticipate that that's probably going to hit $1 million this year. Lastly, in this table is property transfer tax. This is a tax that we collect, that the county collects, $1.10. It's a document tax, $1.10 for every $1,000 of property value sold, and half goes to the county and half comes to the city. And again, that's tied to property sales. And we did have a large refund. There was some litigation for some prior year revenues that had to be refunded back, about 40 or 50,000, that account for some of this deficit as well. So again, at 6 months in, we're about 2.8 million high. If we adjust for that one-time payment, we're about 800,000, and you see the majority of that being in Measure C. This next slide is other revenues. So this accounts for fees, licenses, fines, franchise fees, and so on. And you see it's over budget by about $5 million at mid-year. And again, this is another one where there's that one-time money that I'll get to. But just to hit a couple highlights, fines and forfeitures, this is mostly police citations. So for the last several years, police has had difficulty staffing those police enforcement or police citation enforcement. I believe that they are fully staffed now, and they're in the training period, so it'll take some time before we start seeing those revenues. But that is, we are expecting that those will increase in the second half of the year. Franchise fees, I'm not going to go into, other than to say they're tied very closely with utility users tax. So that you see that the utility users tax was down about 77,000, which is pretty close to this. And then lastly, intergovernmental. This is our mutual aid activity. So firefighters, when they go work for other agencies, there's an overtime cost that they incur, but then we're reimbursed for that through this mechanism. And the revenues come in slightly larger than they do on the overhead cost side. But we are cautious in how we budget for that, because that can sway significantly from year to year as well. So they tend to, the fire department tends to under budget, and then we do a true up at year end. So that's typically how that is accounted for. They budgeted $1 million. We've already received about $1 million, and they're anticipating about $1.4 million by year end. So the last item I wanted to point out, miscellaneous, this is kind of a catch-all. It's our overhead recovery. There's some donations and one-time monies and legal settlements. And we did receive a check from Southern California Edison for about $5.3 million for litigation settlement for the Thomas fire. And that's where you see that $5 million right there. So again, if you back out that $5 million, we're coming in pretty close to budget. And then, the settlement, it's either 5.2 or 5.3. The last slide I have for you today, this is our departmental, this is fees and service charges, so it's our departmental revenues. And you'll see they're trending about 1.9 million below budget at 6 months in. And I just wanted to hit a couple highlights. So community development is down about 360,000. They have 2 main sources of revenue. They have their planning fees and then building and safety fees. Building and safety is tracking pretty close to budget. Where we see the deficits is on the planning side, and there's really 3 drivers for this. One being the zoning information reports. We no longer charge a fee for that, and the impact of that will be approximately $200,000 by year end. This was a decision that was made going into setting the fees, I think, for this year. And then the second item is there are no new large housing proposals that have been received this year due to some uncertainty with the AUD program. And then lastly, design review project applications are coming in lower than anticipated or lower than projected. Next, I wanted to go over Public Works. So this is a trend that we've seen for the last few years in that this is tied to the engineering division. When they have vacancies, they base their budgets or their budgeted revenues on engineers' billable hours. So they're working on projects and on work orders, and with vacancies, we see a reduction in revenues. So this particular revenue, even though there's a reduction in revenues, it's partially offset with salary savings. It's not 100%, but there is some savings on the expenditure side. And then lastly is libraries. This is $370,000 below budget at mid-year, but this is really just a timing difference. We receive revenues from the county on per capita revenues, and we receive those in the second half of the year. Usually, I think in two payments. One might have already been received in January, and then at the end of the year. So that's really it for my presentation. I went a little bit longer just to give a little bit more information for some of the newer members. And again, just to recap, in total, we're seeing about $5.9 million surplus. When we adjust for those one-time monies, we're looking at a deficit of a little over $1 million at mid-year.
So since we're at each section, do we have any questions on revenues at this time?
Okay, I'll hand it over to Mr. Sewell.
Thank you, Ms. Tomaszewski. So I'm Mark Sewell, I'm the accounting manager. Welcome to the committee, Councilmember Gutierrez. I'll be taking you through the expenditure side of the city. And we've kind of focused mainly on the larger operating areas of the city. This is by no means all of the funds that operate within the city, but it's those which are most material to the day-to-day operations. And we obviously have a big focus on the general fund with that importance. And then we go through into the enterprise funds and pull out some of those highlights, as Mrs. Tomaszewski has already mentioned. So within the general fund, there are 12 departments listed before you on the slide here. And no one department obviously is the same size. We have our police and fire departments, which consume the majority of the general fund budget, as is typical with most cities that have public safety. And what this table is designed to do is to try to say, okay, well, where are we at mid-year in the context of our budget? So what we do is we provide a year-to-date budget number, which we calculate based on the typical experience of each of these departments over the last 3 years. How much of the budget have they typically spent by the end of December? And then we multiply that by the annual budget and say, well, if things were the same as they have been over the last 3 years on average, how much should we likely have spent? And that's what that column there represents. So then when we talk about variances and things like that, we also want to consider where are we in the life cycle of actually paying bills and invoices, because, of course, this is a snapshot at mid-year. But this variance that I've highlighted to you here is comparing that year-to-date budget with what's actually been spent or invoiced at that point in time. And so as you can see at mid-year, there were savings, if you want to call them that, of $3.6 million in those general fund departments at mid-year. Now, the main reasons for this, and I'm going to sound like a bit like a broken record as I talk to you through the enterprise funds as well, is that we do have salary and benefit savings in the majority, if not all, of the departments. And that's a factor of the need to actually budget the full position control, because we need to have the council appropriations and authority to be able to have a full staff. But of course, it's very rare that the city ever has full employment, because people leave and there's turnover and there's vacancies, etc. And so that obviously drives savings compared to budget. And Mrs. Tomaszewski already mentioned, we plan for some of that within our revenue line item. So we want to see some savings in here, otherwise we have a bit of an issue with balancing with that revenue target. One of the other things that changed, which was a significant thing across the city, was that benefits changed from January this year, which has a saving across the city, and so we're seeing some of those savings as well in here going forward. This final column I want to just share with you here is that where we are if we take into account encumbrances. An encumbrance basically means a commitment to spend. It doesn't mean you are definitely going to spend, but it's the sum of all of the purchase orders and contracts that the city has outstanding at any one point in time. So at the end of December, there was $4.8 million of commitments to various vendors for various activities, which is likely to then get converted into invoices and actual spends by year end. And so when we look at that, you can see we're about 51% spent because we've got 49% remaining. So all things considered, we're kind of on track and trading as normal in the general fund from an expenditure standpoint. I'll move on to enterprise funds and take questions at any point. Please do jump in. So with our enterprise funds, the next two slides I'm going to show you have 7 enterprise funds. An enterprise fund basically has to finance its operations and capital needs from the revenue that it can generate on its own. It doesn't receive any general taxation support because that is what funds the general fund. So in here we have the solid waste fund, which I wanted to just mention first of all. And you can see that, again, we apply a year-to-date budget, and this is perhaps a bit more noticeable in some of our more seasonal funds where they have, a summer season where they might be earning more revenue than the winter season, etc. And so we try to show what's the seasonality impact on allocating how much of their budget should they have received as revenue and how much would they likely have spent in expenses. And that's why you see revenues and expenses on the same graph because, again, they are treated as if they are their own little businesses. And so with the solid waste fund, at mid-year, we are seeing revenues slightly in excess of our expectation from our budget, and that's to do with a reimbursement from the county of $391,000. We'd never know going into the budget what exactly that's going to be because it's, I think it's to do with the rate stabilization fund, and so at the time of setting a budget, we don't know exactly how that's going to look, and so that can come in and be a smaller or a larger number. So that's contributing to the positive variance in revenue there. And then on the flip side, on the expenditures, again, we're seeing that we're showing at mid-year $655,000 less expenditure. Again, that's a little misleading because actually it's all to do with the timing of a payment, again, back to the county for green and hazardous waste processing. All of this stuff unravels when we get to the end of the year because we make sure that we account for everything in the right fiscal year. It's just one of the challenges of taking a snapshot in time and trying to present you that information. So moving forward into our largest enterprise fund, which is the water fund. What we're seeing here is that our revenue is actually slightly down. It's a large number in $1 million, but as a percentage of the total revenue, of course, it's a little smaller than it would be in a different fund. And we're seeing slightly lower water sales than was budgeted, and the staff in the water department feel that that's, the community are still conserving at levels which are perhaps a little higher than they thought they might. And of course, rainfall and the timing of rain has an impact on irrigation, which is, primarily the discretional water use. And so they aren't seeing the revenue come in as high as they were anticipating. That said, they have had a one-time benefit within that revenue, a litigation settlement for some challenges they had with the recycled water plant. And then on the expenditure side as well, you're seeing some savings there. And there's some delays to some capital projects at the Cater water treatment plant, which would be funded in part for the joint venture. And so those reimbursements and those costs are delayed because that capital project is now delayed. Moving into the wastewater fund, the revenues there are slightly up, and they're seeing strong performance for sewer tap fees as developments coming in a little bit above their assumptions. However, there's a large saving there at mid-year. They've got some new debt payments, and again, what this does, this year-to-date budget takes their total budget and says, well, typically at mid-year you will have spent X percentage of it. Well, these debt payments happen like once a year, and so it's kind of allocating half of an annual payment into the first half of the year and saying, well, you could have spent that by now, but in reality, the timing of it's all happening in the second half of the year. So it's a bit misleading again. When we get to the end of the year, I wouldn't expect to see anything like that magnitude of a saving because the debt payment is being, actually, I think it was actually paid at the start of February. So that's already a real cost now in the second half. I mean, I guess the simple way to say this is that those funds are pretty much all on track, right? But that would be a very quick presentation. You might want a bit more detail than that. So then moving into the last three funds, I'm only really going to pick out the airport fund here. I think you will have seen recently there was some press releases about the fact that the airport is making record levels of passenger enplanements and doing very well. It's actually up 12.6% in its revenue. So that's, a pretty good job. You look at this chart, however, and it'll tell you that they're a little bit behind budget. So I thought it was a little unfair to just give you that view because, of course, they've budgeted significant revenue growth. And they're on track to meet their revenue goals at year end with only a minor variance. And again, like a lot of other departments, they've seen some vacancies and some turnover in headcount, and so therefore projecting some slight salary savings for the end of the year. And so that ends the presentation on the General Fund and Enterprise Fund. I do have some budget adjustments, but if I have questions now, that's perfectly happy to take them.
Any questions on the expenditures at this point? Hearing none, can continue on, Mr.
Wonderful,
Sewell.
thank you. So then the final part of the presentation are the recommended budget adjustments. So in the council agenda packet, there are a number of adjustments. I don't have them all on the slides. We'd be here for a little while going through each and every single one of them. So I've pulled out 2 slides worth, again, focused more around the general fund and also just sharing with you some of the larger movements in a number of our other funds. But the full list is attached to the council agenda report. So in here, this really is a fairly minor adjustment. This is something whereby the fire department has dedicated use of an IT resource, but the way that actually is funded is the IT resource resides in a separate fund and is managed and supervised by the IT professionals to maintain that level of oversight and expertise. And so therefore, we just have to do a transfer between the general fund and the IT fund for that, to enable for that cost to be reimbursed. And so that's where you're seeing the $25,000 in and out. And then this next slide resides within the Public Works Department. Every year we do an analysis of each of our funds, and then we obviously report it in the Comprehensive Annual Financial Review. And that tells us for all of our different funds what they have left over in reserves and available for other projects and other things. And so what the Public Works Department would like to do is to transfer the available reserves at the end of fiscal year 19 from the capital funds for the various different program areas back into the operating fund. And then obviously they can make a decision going forward and recommendations about how they want to utilize that money. So this adjustment here basically transfers what's left over in the capital fund that isn't currently allocated for any project and transfers that back into the operating fund for a decision to be made at a later date. And then with that, I'm happy again to take any questions, but we're hopeful for a recommendation from the Finance Committee to accept the fiscal year 2020 interim financial statements ended 6 months, December 31st, 2019, and to approve the proposed mid-year adjustments to fiscal year 2020 appropriations and estimated revenues as detailed in this presentation and the attached schedule of proposed mid-year adjustments. Thank you.
Great. So before I open up for questions, I'm going to open up public comment. If there's any member of the public who would like to speak to this item on the agenda, please come forward. Seeing none, I will close public comment. Are there any questions from Councilmember Harmon or Councilmember Gutierrez? So I do have one question. It's kind of looking forward, but it has to do with the coronavirus. Actually, there's been a lot of talk on it and a lot of just looking at impacts to travel. But what are some of the things we're looking at just monitoring in addition to I would assume transient occupancy tax? But what are some of the things we're looking at just over time as it continues to be an issue that might affect us?
Sure. So I'll take that one. So where we monitor it is on the investing side. So we look at how that could potentially impact, the federal rates. And really where we're seeing is it's impacting the stock market right now, and it could potentially cause on the bond side, the bonds always take a little bit longer to react. we're not seeing that yet, but that's something we would be monitoring over time to see if that, causes the feds to have to adjust down rates. So that's one area we would see that.
Thank you. I just wanted to just put that out there, so I know it's something that we're going to monitor long term. So, any other questions or comments? If not, is there a motion or?
Thank you. I'll make a quick comment. I just want to say how much I appreciate this, and you guys have done an amazing job putting this together, and something that I have seen throughout the last year being on this committee and seeing again today is just how accurately you guys predict and forecast. I mean, these are so close, and you guys have done such a good job really thinking realistically about what our budget will be and constantly informing us of where we are and where we need to go. And I know gives me, and I think the residents of this city, a lot of confidence that you're keeping your eye on things and that we're just being very responsible with the budget. And I know every time we get a presentation like this, I walk away feeling just a real surge of confidence in that. So I just want to say thank you. And with that, I would like to move staff recommendations.
I second it.
Thank
you.
you. So I echo the comments. Thank you for the great job just updating us and going into the background too. It's always helpful to hear the background and the nuances of the timing of some of the revenues and expenditures. So with that, call for the vote. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed, abstain, none. And forward to council. And thank you for your time. And this meeting is adjourned.
Thank you very much.